Followers of the Way. As the Zen school sees it, life and death are under a certain order. In interviews, the student should consider the smallest detail. When host and guest appear, there is an exchange of discourse. Sometimes form is shown as corresponding to things. Sometimes the whole body is brought into function. Sometimes the full power of solemn authority is exercised to evoke awe. Sometimes half the body is revealed. Sometimes the lion is mounted, sometimes the elephant. So this is a short passage from the record of Rinzai, the Rinzai Roku. Master Rinzai, of course, being one of the great Tang dynasty Zen masters, lived and died in the 8th century. Tang dynasty going from the 6th to the 9th century in China. And here we have a short passage where he really puts his finger on what the Zen school is about, and really not just the Zen school, but Buddhism is about, because he begins by saying followers of the way, and he's of course referring to his monks, but the way he's talking about is the way of the Mahayana, the great way, the Bodhisattva path, the path to awakening. And any of us who train in his lineage are followers of that same way as well. So we are part of the audience. Followers of the way, as the Zen school sees it, life and death are under a certain order. And in fact, this is common in really all Buddhist countries. Buddhism does death, if you like. That's one of its major teachings, really, because this is just another way of talking about impermanence, talking about anicca, as it's called, which the Buddha had down as one of the 3 signs of being, along with suffering and no I. But really at the heart of the Buddha's teachings, what makes sense of the Buddha's teachings is the fact that everything about us and everything inside and outside of us is of course impermanent. And why is this so important? Well, it's important because looking at the 4 Noble Truths, the second Noble Truth that gives the cause of suffering is clinging attachment. I know it's sometimes put as craving or desire, but craving and desire are the result of clinging attachment, of wanting something to be, and or wanting something to become extinct if I don't like it. And in fact, the Buddha defined desire, the second Noble Truth, is threefold. The desire for sense pleasure, temporary fulfillments, the desire for existence, and the desire for non-existence. The desire for existence, of course, is I want to be whatever it is I want to be. Famous. I remember my cousin when she was helping out in a classroom with her own daughter, and the teacher said to very common question to the small class there, what would you like to be when you grow up? And my cousin was appalled when I think about 50% of them said famous. But anyway, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. This desire, or this ambition, if you like, this is a craving for existence. And of course there's nothing wrong with having an ambition. Most people do. It's a healthy thing. But if it's the only thing that I can envision, well, there's a lot of things that can happen. It's like the story of the young man who had great potential to be a footballer, and then was in a car accident and lost a foot. And he said, my life is over. Well, he was a young man, and I guess it would feel like that. Hopefully he found another way to a fulfilled and successful life. And of course, life is very adaptable. Life is very adaptable. Even if you look at the evolution, that's all about adaptation and adapting to changing circumstances in order to survive, and to not just survive, but to thrive as well. So, the problem with desire in this case, or the problem with my desire in this case, is that it can be very narrow. And it forms self-beliefs, and those self-beliefs, these are what I say I am, and I am not different. I am not other than those things. And so I can get very hemmed in, and literally down to something as banal as, oh, I must have 2 cups of coffee in the morning, otherwise I can't, face the day. I mean, if I really do believe that, and then life comes along and takes away those 2 cups of coffee, what then? Do I fall apart? Or do somehow the reserves of inner strength are drawn on, and we face the day and carry on? And usually what we find with desires, particularly my desires, is that they burn very brightly and very hot for a short period of time, but then they blow out and we move on to something else. So this desire for existence, or in another case for non-existence, if it's something that I don't like and I want it to go away, this is what the Buddha defined as desire, and therefore the cause of suffering. And that clinging to what I want, and clinging to what I don't want, and clinging to sense pleasure, that I must have my 2 cups of coffee. These are the things that narrow everything down and cause us to forget the great strength, the great bearing strength, and the inner strength, the spiritual strength that in fact we have. And so this great matter of life and death, as it's called, Master Rinzai calls it a number of things: the ocean of birth and death, the great matter, or the great matter of life and death, is referred to, and not just by Rinzai, but many of the Zen masters. This ultimately is what we are concerned with. Don't forget, the Buddha himself set that particular wheel in motion, when he took those 4 fateful trips outside of the palace and saw, old age, sickness, and death writ large. And this is what we fear. Maybe not put in quite this language, but actually, if we look at what we are afraid of, well, it's being denied, not getting what I want, and that causes a mini death for me if I'm really, really attached to it. The other thing about this, because what he says is that life and death are under a certain order, that there's a relationship here. And there is. Don't forget, in really all Buddhist countries, whether it's Japan or China, or Sri Lanka or Thailand or Vietnam, if you go into a Buddhist household, you'll see a Buddhist shrine, but you'll also see an ancestral altar as well. This is where the family ancestors are venerated, and because the living have to remember the dead, and there's good reason for that. I mean, just at a very surface level, it reminds us who we are and where we're from. That's the importance of tradition. And the other thing is that the ancestors are seen as the repository of wisdom, because they have experience the things that we are experiencing many times, and so they have the wisdom of how to face those common difficulties that we all share. As an old Austrian saying puts it, when everyone sleeps under the same blanket, everyone knows where the holes are. And so it is with life. We know where the difficulties are, but the tradition carries the wisdom of how to face those things, which is why it's important not to just throw away tradition willy-nilly. So, yes, in that way, the living venerate the dead, they remember the dead, they pay their respect to the dead, and in return, the wisdom of the dead is remembered. And is continuous. It has continuity, and it provides help and assistance for the living. So that's the relationship that we have there, even just at that very surface level. In interviews, the student should consider the smallest details. So obviously one of the teaching methods in Rinzai Zen is the use of interviews, either with or without koans. But whatever happens, it's a very intense encounter between the master and the pupil, or the master and the disciple. And it's the master's ability to be able to see exactly where the student is and where they're coming from. And usually one of the ways that this happens is because the student will ask a question. And a question is always revealing, because it reveals how we see ourselves, or how we see the world, or how we see, a situation, for example, such as, daily life practice or meditation. If people come up and say, well, I can't make my mind a blank, for example, in Zazen, then the teacher can see already the error that person's making in their attempt in meditation. They are grasping at something. They're grasping at an end result. And that in itself, that grasping in itself, of course, will get in the way of the seeing. So, a question always, reveals itself. And, there are many such encounters which you can read in the sort of Zen literature, that go in this way. Famous one, for example, is the sixth patriarch, who came across two monks who were arguing over a flag that was fluttering in the breeze, and one of the monks was saying, "Oh, it's the flag that flutters," and the other was saying, "No, it's the wind that moves the flag," and they fell into a dispute over this, and it got quite heated. And then the sixth patriarch came up behind them and said, "It is neither the flag nor the wind that flutters, but the hearts of the venerable monks that are all aflutter," immediately bringing it back to home, immediately causing the two monks to suddenly become aware of their own disturbance, inner disturbance, and that they were becoming carried away. So this is a very typical thing. This is a very typical way that the teacher-pupil relationship will work. And indeed, the another role for the teacher is to actually become the disciple's obstruction. And we may sort of think, well, why does surely the teacher is there to facilitate, the student? But actually, this is not the case in Zen, because Zen is not an education in the ordinary schooling sense at all. It's a transformative process. And the key to transformation is the obstacle, the difficulty, the challenge. Because, as we said before, when I'm denied those 2 cups of coffee, when I feel that I must have them, in order for that self-belief to be overturned and the heart to be released from it, then the challenge is to be denied those 2 cups of coffee. So, Zen masters are very good at seeing what the disciple really wants and then denying it or taking it away. And that's often quite enough. And the interesting thing, of course, is that life itself can do that. But the thing is, the difference in the Zen monastery is that, if you like, it's actually safer to do it there, because life in a temple or life in a monastery can get quite intense. But the intensity is not going to be a threat to life and limb, or very, very rarely. Mostly it's just my pride that gets hurt. And that's fine, because we can all recover from that. And in fact, being taken down a peg or two is necessary for insight. This was something that Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychologist, pointed out. He said it's, wisdom or consciousness through suffering. The way we become more conscious, in this case of the unconscious and the unconscious elements, is through suffering them out. And this is true, particularly, for example, when we're working with the fires, working with the emotions, and we're containing those emotions. On the outside, we are maintaining a good form, an ethical form, a polite form, a human form, in the best way we can. But on the inside, we're fully acknowledging the churning of the fires and the eruption of the fires. The fires still burn, I am still here. please burn me away. And we encounter them at that gut level, at that physical level, in the body. So in interviews, yes, the student should consider the smallest details, because it's often because this is another thing. Who decides what's important and what isn't important? Because we could use these smallest details, there's a sort of implied judgment in that, a large detail or a small detail or an important detail, in other words, is a large detail, but a small detail, it's not very important, easy to dismiss. And the master says, no, look at this, because if we don't, we're seeing this incorrectly. And it's interesting because those things that I often deny, or those things that in fact often cause me the most problems, are precisely the small details that have been ignored for a long time. It's like, the Buddha's parable of the rope, the man who, going home in the twilight and sees what he thinks is a snake crossing the road, and he jumps back in alarm. But the Buddha's there and tells him to look again, and he does, and he realizes that what he thought was a snake was in fact just a piece of old rope that someone had apparently discarded. See, notice how the bit of story gets added to it. And then finally the Buddha tells him to pick up the rope, and he does. And as he brings it close to his eyes in the dying light, he realizes that it's not a rope either, it's a string of gems. It was always a string of gems. But first he saw a snake, something that frightened him, and then a piece of old rope, something that's unimportant and not threatening, and so would go to step over it. And he would have missed a treasure if he'd done that. But it was the Buddha that pointed this out to him, and so it wasn't lost after all. And this is the case with us also in our own training. It's those small things. I often think if somebody says, what are your weaknesses? And I can sort of reel off a few things, etc. But often the real difficulties come from the blind spot, the bit that we don't generally look at. So hence, the student should consider in interviews the smallest detail. When host and guest appear, there is an exchange of discourse. So this host and guest actually is it's a device that Master Rinzai used, and it appears throughout his sermons and teachings. He talks about host and guest quite a lot, and really this is just like a lot of these things. It's just another pair of opposites. And that's how we should see it. But in this case, the host and guest are two roles. But they're two roles, and the whole point about opposites is that they are interrelated. You're only a host because you have guests, and you can only be a guest in the place or the home of the host, for example. So these the host and guest is, if you like, it's a little it's just an expression of a pair of opposites that has this sort of interrelationship and a codependency, and the whole point here is that when it comes to I am all about my identity. So I either see myself as a host or I see myself as a guest. And what happens is, rather than accepting that these roles are always temporary, instead what happens is that I feel that somehow, as a host, I've not been given enough respect by the guest, for example, and so I get upset with that. Or if I'm the guest, I feel that the host is neglecting me, and I'm not happy with that either. And I take it as a personal slight. And this is the thing: when the passions erupt, often it feels existential, and yet my passions can erupt for all sorts of things that are in no way really a threat to my survival. Take, for example, something that I feel strongly about. If someone contradicts my opinion, for example, I can get very heated. My blood can boil, and it feels almost like a person. Well, does feel like a personal attack. Why? Because I have become identified with that opinion. I am that opinion. That opinion is me. And so if my opinion is attacked, then I am attacked as well. And this is why Myokyo-ni used to suggest a little experiment, which was with a friend and a recording device. Ask the friend to, play the devil's advocate for some of your most cherished opinions. Give them full permission, and then set the recorder running, and for about half an hour, and your friend starts, throwing in one or two curveballs, as they say. Now, you know perfectly well that this is an artificial setup. This is a whole setup. But it doesn't matter, because once the passions are stimulated, once they're triggered, then it all becomes very real all too quickly. And after half an hour, set an alarm so that when that alarm goes, you stop. And maybe have another friend there just to keep the peace if necessary. And then switch off the recording device and put it away for a week. And then after a week, come back to it and re-listen to it. And just hear one's own voice, how it changes as the energy of the passions comes up. The voice goes from sounding relatively reasonable to becoming strident, maybe deep and booming, or high and whining, but there's a real strength in it either way. And what's more, I'll hear myself declare the most asinine banalities with a God Almighty certainty at my, interlocutor. And there we have it. There we have, a fully fledged argument, and that's a classic host and guest. It's a classic host and guest example there. And yes, there is an exchange of discourse. There's there's that example, for example, of the two Americans who were interested in Zen. I think this was in the 50s, and they went over to Japan, and they wanted to see what it was like in its native country. And so they sort of rocked up at a small temple, and they were introduced to the priest there, who was no one. He wasn't a great Zen master or anything. He was just an ordinary Zen priest, and asked if they could have a look around. And he said, yes, of course. And so he showed them around, and he had a little bit of broken English as well, so he could, explain things to them. And you always start off with the shrine room. That's how it goes. And so he said, this is the shrine room. This is where we do the chanting in the morning. And of course, he bowed to the Buddha as he crossed the threshold. And then he took them to the Zendo, and he said, and this is where we do the Zazen. And he bowed to the Buddha on the altar. And then they said, and this is the community room. And there was a little bodhisattva, which he bowed as he stepped over the threshold. And in the kitchen, here is the where the food is prepared. And as he walked in, there's a little kitchen bodhisattva which he bowed to as well, as he had always done. And the two Americans who had been brought up on this, beat Zen and iconoclasm, were watching this, becoming more and more, upset that this wasn't the Zen that they had been reading about, that they liked the iconoclastic stuff. And in the end, one of them sort of erupted, saying, why are you bowing to all these idols? He said, why? He said, I could spit at them. And the little priest, now remember, this priest would have been ordained as a monk as a boy. His father would have been the temple incumbent before him, and his grandfather before him. So Buddhism was everything. And suddenly these two foreigners appear and start disparaging, the thing that's of central value to everything in his life. But all he does is he nods and in his broken English says, okay, he says, you spits, I bows. Sometimes form is shown as corresponding to things. Yes. So, for example, the form of things, everything has a form. Everything. and the form dictates how we use it and how we relate to it as well. And showing that the form is corresponding to things is very straightforward. So, we have a Buddha and we bow to it. This is the form of the Buddha. Why do we bow to it? Well, we can go on and say, oh, but it's, it's a piece of metal, or it's a piece of lump of clay, or whatever. Well, yes, I mean, we could say that a human being is a person. We could also say that a human being is a colony of cells. One doesn't negate the other, in other words, and two or more things can be true about something all at the same time. Now, that's often quite difficult for me because I like to see things in quite black and white terms, because I am quite black and white. And so I think, no, it's either psychological or it's the object itself has some kind of holy essence in its own right. And it has to be one or other of those things. It cannot be both at the same time. Well, this is something that's played very much with by the old Zen masters, but sometimes it's useful just to treat things as they are. That if you have a sacred scripture, you don't treat it as a paperback novel. You treat it with respect and with awe. Sometimes, and if there's a Buddha, we bow to the Buddha. I remember a friend of mine who had been to Sri Lanka, which is one of the oldest continuously Buddhist countries in the world. There are some beautiful rock carvings, Buddhist rock carvings of Buddhas, that you can go and see there, and they're a place of great veneration, but it's a great tourist area as well. And the person who went, who was British, said it was about halfway through he said, all us tourists were sort of snapping away photographs and having photographs of ourselves in front of these statues, and then we'd be turning our backs and walking away. He said, when I looked at the locals, none of them turned their back on the Buddha. And of course they wouldn't. Now, you could say, well, that's, these are, in the end, they're just lumps of rock. Surely this is superstitious. But it's not about that. It's about that real sense of awe for the Buddha Dharma and for the Buddha, and what that represents and what that is for those people. Those statues are statues, yes, but they're more than just statues as well. Sometimes the whole body is brought into function, and by the whole body, really what is meant is the heart, which is the essence of a thing. And this is the wholeheartedness. So in other words, Master Rinzai was famous for what's called his katsu, which is his great shout. And using this shout, he could startle, if the monk was ripe, it could startle the monk out of himself and cause the heart to become empty, quiet, and to attain to great insight. So this is the wholeheartedness that we practice in daily life, because our practice is to be wholeheartedly give ourselves into everything that we are doing. Just this moment, just this moment, just this moment. Sometimes the full power of solemn authority is exercised to evoke awe. There's another passage where Master Rinzai talks about the different robes that he wears. He says, sometimes he wears the ordinary robes of a monk, and sometimes he wears this purple brocade of the Lord High Abbot, and sometimes he wears nothing at all, and he goes around naked. And he says, when I wear the brocade, the monks are all beside themselves, saying, "Oh, just look how wonderful our master is." But when I walk around naked, they all shriek and run around, saying, "He has no clothes." And then I shout at them and say, "Look, look, do you see him who wears all these robes? Do you know him?" Of course, he's not talking literally here, but the point is that there is someone who wears all these roles. These robes are the roles that we wear, aren't they? And so one of the, yes, evoking great awe, yeah. If you go to a great ceremony, you can see that, it's very richly decorated, and a lot of time and money will have gone into it, and it evokes something in us. I mean, it really does work. If you go into a church or a cathedral, for example, and they are designed to draw your eye and your senses in, and to open you up. And it's the same in a great temple as well. And ceremony is part of that as well. It's transformative, even if it's only temporary. And then he says, sometimes half the body is revealed. Well, okay, yes, sometimes. So half is revealed and half is hidden. So Zen is not a religion that spoon feeds. In fact, we really have to work for it. And that's important because we can become lazy, and we can become entitled. And Zen has no room for that. Sometimes the lion is mounted, sometimes the elephant. So the lion is the power animal of the great Bodhisattva Manjushri, because Manjushri rides a blue lion, and that is the animal that's associated with Manjushri. So Manjushri is the Bodhisattva of wisdom. So what he's saying is that sometimes he expresses the heart's wisdom, and then said sometimes the elephant. Well, the elephant is the power animal of Samantabhadra, who is one of the bodhisattvas of compassion, and specifically he's the bodhisattva of compassion in activity, and that means that's referring to what we call daily life practice, the practice of compassion or meditation in activities. So he may show it in the things he does. There was one Zen master, for example, and he had one disciple, and the disciple got a bit bored because he didn't seem to get any teachings from him, and so he decided to leave and go to a few other places. But everywhere he went, he kept hearing his original master being praised very highly as being such an excellent teacher. So finally he made his way back to his teacher, and he said, everywhere I go, they say you're an incredible teacher, but you never taught me anything. He said, that's not true. He said, I never stopped teaching you from the moment you came to me. He said, no, you didn't. He said, yes, I did. He said, whenever you offered me rice, didn't I stretch out my bowl so you could put into it? Whenever you offered me tea, did I not stretch out my cup so that you could fill it? Just this. Of course, again, it goes back to observing the smallest detail to really understand. So there we have it, in this quite a short passage, but quite a full one as well, where Master Rinzai gives the essence of what the Zen school is about, the teachings, but also the different teaching methods that one can expect to encounter along the way. All right, we'll leave it there.